Foreign journalists under attack in Egypt. They're accused of bias and of ignoring facts, and many have been detained, attacked, some even killed. But is this a fair accusation? Or are Egypt's rulers simply angry at the media for documenting their crackdown against protesters? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Shihab Rishansi. As the bloody stalemate in Egypt continues, its interim rulers have found a new target for criticism: the international media. Egypt is feeling bitter about your coverage of the Muslim Brotherhood, so complained the government, which says it's fighting terrorism and not peaceful protesters. The criticism of the foreign press has coincided with an increase in attacks on journalists in Cairo and elsewhere. A number have been either threatened or detained by the security services or groups of men in the last few days. And on Sunday, Egypt's interim government said it would review the legal status of Al Jazeera because of what it says is its biased coverage. Shireen Tadros has more from Cairo.
Egypt says it's fighting terrorism, and in case you didn't get the memo, here's a reminder from the government. A carefully prepared presentation for foreign media showing what it says are armed protesters. But this was not a charm offensive, it was a telling off.
The international community did not condemn the criminal acts perpetrated, including setting fires to mosques, churches, museums, hospitals, public and private companies.
Since the dispersal of the anti-coup sit-ins, interim government officials as well as the Army Chief General Sisi have portrayed international media channels, including Al Jazeera, as the enemy of Egyptians, accusing some outlets of lying. The suggestion that the killing of hundreds of protesters was an excessive use of police force sparked a wave of criticism by local media against the foreign press. The effect has created a hostile working environment where journalists have been harassed on the street and in some cases detained by authorities while trying to work. So have foreign media got the Egypt story wrong?
You have a situation where there is a huge power imbalance. I mean, we call these things clashes, but if it's a clash where 0 people die on one side and 60 people die on the other, it's almost biased to call that a clash. So there's a natural power imbalance, and I do think the journalists, as humans, tend to side with the underdog in this situation. But beyond that, I do think they're covering things fairly down the middle.
But while criticism has been leveled at the foreign press, the government has said nothing about local media coverage. And that narrative has been dominated by the pro-military narrative. Take this cartoon in a privately owned newspaper. It shows journalists snapping up pictures of a dead body while men with beards holding guns and burning churches are all around them. And it's not just the newspapers. By shutting down channels seen as sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, other networks feed the audience the government line. For them, it's about countering the Brotherhood's propaganda.
Good evening again. I would like to...
On TV in Mehwar, local pro-military channels have been sporadically switching to English translation in mid-broadcast to make sure their message travels further afield. As the local media scene becomes dominated by one narrative while the others are attacked, there are similarities to the Mubarak era, when there was little freedom of a press. The military say they are leading the country in a march towards democracy, but it's increasingly starting to look like a giant step back. Shireen Tadros, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by 3 guests. From Ottawa, Adel Iskander, Professor of Communications and Media at Georgetown University. He is also author of Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution. From London, Tom Fenton, former senior correspondent for CBS News and author of Bad News, The Decline of Reporting, the Business of News and the Danger to Us All. And from New York, Sharif Mansour, Middle East and North Africa Programme Coordinator for the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists. Actually, Sharif Mansour, let me ask you a few questions right here at the top. When we refer to a crackdown on international journalists, what specifically do we mean? How does that manifest itself?
It means several tactics that has been used by the government, the interim government, since they took over. One of them is political control of the narrative. And we've seen that happening in many ways by intimidation, threatening tactics that was targeted mainly at foreign journalists. But also the interim government have started, since they've ousted President Morsi, in promoting what they've said code of ethics that will guarantee that the media is following Egypt's national interest. And that is not just directed towards foreign journalists, but it's mainly for local and regional stations. And since 6 weeks ago, the military have already shuttered at least 5 TV stations that are sympathetic to President Morsi and the Brotherhood, and they have raided several of those government and arrested hundreds and then released many of them. But today there is at least 5 of them, 5 journalists who work with TV stations that are sympathetic to President Morsi behind bars.
But under
those.
What charges there? I mean, under what charges are these stations being shut down and these journalists being arrested? Is it the usual incitement to violence or something like that?
They say incitement of violence, but so far there hasn't been a legal charge that was put forward in the court. The interrogation that started on July 3rd against hundreds of journalists that were rounded up from the media production city included charges of conspiring to overturn the regime. Other charges also include like their relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, and those were the interrogations mainly. Later on, we found out from the military and also from people who are close to the military that those TV stations will not allowed to operate until they sign on this supposed code of ethics that we haven't seen so far.
We should be clear, though, did this sort of crackdown on domestic journalists then begin with the military's overthrow of Morsi, or was there a crackdown even before that?
Of course. President Morsi himself waged a campaign against the media. He has a very adversarial attitude against local and international media whose coverage was deemed critical. And over the course of 1 year under his tenure, we've documented 78 attacks, physical assaults that took place by Morsi supporters against local and international media. And in addition to that, there was hundreds of complaints against journalists, legal charges accusing them of insulting the president, legal defamation, and all other tactics that has been inherited by Morsi regime and now by the interim government from Mubarak. Because so far over the last 2 years, there hasn't been real progress in terms of reforming the legal environment and the operational environment for the media in Egypt, in spite of having a great revolution that called for freedom, including freedom of the press. We still have more than 70 articles in different penal codes in the Egyptian law that allows the government to exercise control and political intervention in the media coverage.
All right, so President Morsi had his go, now the military is having its turn, and we had that statement from the Egyptian State Information Service. They released a statement to journalists on Saturday detailing what it sees as media bias. And in fact, in the first paragraph, it's terribly complimentary. It says that the SIS appreciates facilitating the great job of foreign correspondents through supplying them with all the facts about the current situation in Egypt. But then it goes on, quote, media coverage has steered away from objectivity and neutrality, which has led to a distorted image that is very far from the facts. It goes on to say Egypt is feeling severe bitterness towards some Western media coverage that is biased to the Muslim Brotherhood and ignores shedding light on violent and terror acts that are perpetrated by this group. Tom Fenton, specifically it says the Western media coverage is ignoring the intimidation of the Muslim Brotherhood, the violence of the Muslim Brotherhood, the attacks on the churches, police stations. Is that a fair charge, do you think?
Only halfway. Because there have been reports in the Western media in recent weeks on the attacks on the churches, and there has been mention in the last few days of acts of violence, apparently among the protesters. But it's such an overwhelming story that the Western media is covering. When you have hundreds of dead, when you have mass protests, when you have scenes like the scenes inside the Fatah Mosque in Cairo, the story is quite clear. There has been an exaggerated and an overwhelming use of force by the government, and no amount of lecturing by press officials, government officials, can cover up the fact.
Right, but Professor Iskander, is that a satisfactory explanation? Perhaps actually, especially when it comes to TV news, we're not simply equipped to cover the complexity of a story like Egypt. We get overwhelmed with that disproportionate use of force. So therefore, the attacks on churches and schools, the complex low-level insurgency that's going on the Sinai Peninsula with the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafists joined and so forth, important parts of the story, which perhaps even explain why much of the Egyptian domestic audience is so predisposed against the Muslim Brotherhood, is being ignored in the international media.
Well, I mean, to a large extent, the problem with covering Egypt now is that it's a very disparate story. I mean, most of what we watch on television is coming out of Cairo, but fundamentally, both the protests and the reactions on the part of the police force, as well as the burnings of the churches and police stations, as well as the sort of the upsurge or uptick in violence, is happening literally all over the country. So there is a Cairo-centric aspect to this that dates back all the way to the early days of the revolution, when it was all about Tahrir, with all cameras sort of gazing into this one epicenter of action. And of course, Egypt is a far more complex, far more nuanced story. Now, the nuance becomes extremely problematic when we realize that Egypt actually dropped from the headlines for a significant part of the last year during Morsi's rule. I mean, there were protests there, but they never made their way up to the headlines. And so I think international media have essentially missed out on sort of a growing disparagement within Egyptian society towards the Muslim Brotherhood. And so that hasn't come through. You know, from one minute we have a democratically elected president, the next minute he's being toppled by the military. And the strong disgruntlement within Egyptian society is an intriguing dimension that has been missed by the international media. So everything else becomes a consequence of the military's ouster of Morsi. Now, to focus this a little bit more on the sort of the Egyptian media scene, the Egyptian media have been largely very revolutionary in the aftermath of the toppling of Hosni Mubarak. So they've become empowered, they've become much freer than ever before. And over time, because of pressures during Morsi's time in power, many of them have felt an existential threat. Many of them were targeted by populist movements that were driven by the Muslim Brotherhood and others, besieging the media production cities, death threats against journalists. So this existential threat has turned what were revolutionary journalists who were opposed to the Mubarak era and were playing the watchdog role into attack dogs against the Muslim Brotherhood, and are essentially happy to see the Muslim Brotherhood essentially dissipate, and are happy to go, you know, basically both swallow the pill and jump on the bandwagon of the military's vilification of the Muslim Brotherhood. So right now the Egyptian media scene is highly polarized, but still the public opinion in Egypt is overwhelmingly against the Muslim Brotherhood, which allows the state to do what it's doing today without significant reaction from the Egyptian public at large.
Sharif.
And in fact, arguably, the Egyptians are cheering on as the state targets the international media as well. Most Egyptians are actually demanding that the international media be silenced or driven out. So it's a very complex and very problematic situation. But I think the issue here is losing sight of where Egyptians stand and being able to cater to what it is that they are thinking at any given moment. And the problem exists on both fronts, both among the Egyptian media and the international media, whose performance has been abysmal thus far, across the board, literally.
Sharif Mansour, just to pick up that point, as far as your organization is concerned, are you seeing overt censorship and guidance from the military over the media outlets that still exist, or is it rather willing self-censorship on the part of those outlets to downplay the disproportionality of the military's response and the killings and so forth?
Well, we've seen a combination of both. From one side, the army were not shy on enforcing censorship directly with executive and administrative decisions by simply shutting down those organizations without any legal review or independent review from anybody. In addition to that, we've noticed over the past few weeks that a lot of the private station, Egyptian news station, in absence of voices that are supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood, have adopted a very similar approach to responding to events. We've seen, for example, in the Presidential Guard massacre, that the Muslim Brotherhood have talked a lot about in the media. Their supporters in the media and also the international foreign correspondents have covered extensively. It was very little news about it in Egyptian local media. And not just that, the perspective of the military on the events of what happened was precisely given by all those stations in even the same words. So the narrative that the Brotherhood have said, that there was a massacre and people were peacefully demonstrating, did not make it to any of the local news stations. All the local stations basically said the army account that those people were trying to storm in the Presidential Guard, and the Presidential Guard had to defend themselves by firing on them.
Right.
So we see that as a combination of both army censorship and self-censorship, and some biases as well between the media, because for so long those same private media have been under attack by the Brotherhood over the last year, and some of them are simply taking revenge against the Brotherhood.
Well, let's look at the rather, I mean, it's a pretty crude narrative, frankly, that is being spun by the military, although not terribly different from that which is usually spun by the US administration, for example. It's a war on terror. We have this terrible enemy. And in fact, quite interestingly, media from around the world is using pictures from the state media feed, including Al Jazeera. And in the last few days, that's meant that a tag reading "Egypt fighting terrorism" has been printed on the screen, reflecting the government line that some members of the Muslim Brotherhood are terrorists, the state is engaged in a fight against terror and everything. However, Tom Fenton, it's interesting, as far as the international media is concerned, that tactic doesn't seem to be working. There seems to be a great deal of skepticism about that, a lot of sort of meta discussion about tactics. In fact, one kind of wishes that the international media were as skeptical when the US uses similar tactics, well, when President Obama uses it when he talks about drones. But they don't seem to be buying it as far as when the Egyptians use this war against terror line.
No, well, I think the Egyptian government apparatus, the media machine, is extraordinarily clumsy. It's almost embarrassing. It's laughable. And no, the Western media are not buying it. When they say, for example, I believe the presidential spokesman, that this is not a clash of political ideas, it's a war against terror. Well, it is a clash of political ideas.
Right, but then the point is, though, the US media laps that up all the time when President Obama says it, when President Bush says it, when Dan Rather, the old CBS anchor, your old company, after 9/11 said, well, the job after a terrorist attack is to stand behind my commander-in-chief. The US media completely lapped up all that propaganda. Should we be surprised that the Egyptian media does the same?
No, I'm not surprised. I'm not being critical. I'm just describing the situation as it is. America, of course, has been there, done that. America has
and is still doing it.
No interest right now for any kind of intervention in the affairs of the Middle East. And of course, the hands-off position on Egypt is typical of that. There's another problem too. American television, especially, doesn't do nuance. It barely does foreign news. When you have 18 minutes or 19 minutes of news on your evening news program, and only a very small part of that is dedicated to foreign news, you're not going to do nuance. So there's very little that is being said about the underlying problems, how the public feels, the fact that, sure, this was a coup, but it was a popular coup. And I wouldn't expect our coverage to get any better.
Adel Iskander, though, you say, well, look, the media is only reflecting public opinion, but shouldn't there be some room to discuss proportionality, those pesky international standards of proportionality? So if someone has a rifle in a crowd of people, it doesn't give you the excuse to kill everyone, or at least kill loads of people surrounding them and so forth. Do journalists really buy what they're doing? Do they feel that they're doing the right thing as far as you can see?
Well, I mean, for the most part, the pattern is that public opinion is both shaped by the media and public opinion is a consequence of the media. So really, the dynamics are two ways. But at the end of the day, excessive violence is excessive violence. Brute force is brute force. And so when during the war on terror, or at the very least around 2002, when the U.S. media was busy drumming up support for the war in Iraq, there was significant support for it, and it was you may not want to call it active muzzling of the media, but it was definitely some sort of self-censorship and the lapping up of this perspective. So I think Egypt right now is going through its own 2002, where
when an Egyptian government spokesperson,
the government spokesperson,
the forces acting with self-restraint and self-control. I mean, really, the journalists in that press conference are just going to lap it up and not ask any questions, not even snigger in a kind of gallows humor sort of manner. I mean, clearly, by any objective standard, that simply is not true, that statement.
No, of course it isn't. And this is the construction of illusion that the Egyptian state has been doing for literally 20, 30 years. The Egyptian media have had a significant problem, and the State Information Service, the office that issued this statement, has been trying to control media on Egypt for the last 10, 15 years. Today, it's not going to be any different. The real sort of significant turning point is the fact that the Egyptian public, for the first time in a very long while, is actually cheering on as the Egyptian private networks, as opposed to just the state television, are coming out in disfavor against the Muslim Brotherhood and basically accusing them of excessive violence on their front and absolving the state of the violence that it's committing. So really, there are two sides of the story, and the two sides are not being represented equally, depending on which side politically some of these media organizations lie, but the state is still incapable of controlling the message functionally as far as the international media is concerned.
But Professor Iskander, I wonder whether the part of the problem there is that there are not two sides of this story. There are at least three, maybe four, maybe five. There are quite a few sides of this. That the opposition to the military is being summarized as pro-Morsi Muslim Brotherhood. It's either you're with us or against us. I wonder whether that narrative, which has been taken on by the international media, is actually helping the military.
I mean, I think, Shahab, you've absolutely nailed it. The key here is to dichotomize and binarize the Egyptian audience largely, which is exactly what's happened. You have sort of the state media during the Morsi era basically pushing a specific agenda. The other side, the private networks, become the immediate opposition, the watchdogs, and then all of a sudden the entire system crumbles completely, and then you end up having stations like Al Jazeera, if you will allow me to say, especially Al Jazeera Arabic and Mubashir Mas, which is directed towards Egypt, playing a significant role in drumming up support for the Muslim Brotherhood. And that in and of itself became sort of a psychic reaction on the part of Egyptians who, after a year of Morsi's time in power, saw that the Al Jazeera Arabic was doing sort of a disgraceful job covering the failures of Morsi and instead drumming him up. So Al Jazeera Arabic and Mubashir Mas almost became government, an extension of government media directed towards Egypt. So unfortunately, the polarization exists on all fronts, and the Egyptian public is being taken for a ride. And this ride is leading towards a very ominous outcome. But at the end of the day, I think most news organizations, either for lack of professionalism or the inability to cover stories, or basically ignorance, are either missing one aspect of the story or not able to fill it in. And these voids are absolutely critical because they create the kind of gulf that can help lead Egypt towards a far more dangerous situation, akin to, let's say, what's going on in Syria. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but still, that media polarization eliminates the middle ground.
All right. Adel Iskander, thank you very much. Tom Fenton, thank you. And Sharif Mansour, thank you very much as well. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.